The first time my wife, Laura, mentioned throwing a house party, I brushed it off. "It'll be fun," she'd said, twirling her wine glass between her fingers with a coy smile. "Just a little gathering. Some friends, good music, that's all." I had been in the middle of packing for my business trip and gave her the same nonchalant response I always did when she was on one of her whims. "Sure, babe. Do whatever makes you happy." If only I had known. The next morning, as I left for my flight, Laura stood on the porch, her blonde hair catching the sunlight like spun gold. She kissed me goodbye, her lips brushing against mine, lingering just long enough to remind me why I married her. "Don't work too hard," she teased, her green eyes sparkling with affection, or at least what I thought was affection. "And don't forget to call when you land." "Of course," I said, chuckling. "Behave yourself while I'm gone." "Always," she replied with a smirk that now, in hindsight, feels like a slap across the face. The flight to Seattle was uneventful, and by the time I checked into the hotel, Laura had already sent me a text, "Miss you already. Call me when you're free." I called her from the hotel room. She answered after 2 rings, her voice light and cheerful. "Hey, babe! How was the flight?" "Uneventful. How's everything back home?" "Oh, you know, same old. Ava and Grace are stopping by later. Girls' night." Her tone was breezy, casual, the picture of a wife enjoying her time while her husband was away. It was only later, too late, that I realized. Girls' night was the beginning of her carefully laid web of lies. Over the next 2 days, my schedule was packed. Meetings bled into dinners, and my phone barely left my hand as I juggled emails and calls. Laura, meanwhile, kept in touch like clockwork, sending sweet little texts and photos of our dog snoozing on the couch. She played her part so perfectly that I never suspected a thing. On the 3rd night, after another grueling day of negotiations, I finally had a moment to myself. Sitting in the hotel bar, nursing a whiskey, I scrolled through the Nest app on my phone. The home cameras were a recent addition, something I'd installed after a break-in down the street a few months ago. I hadn't checked them in weeks, but tonight, on a whim, I decided to take a look. The first camera feed, the front door, showed nothing out of the ordinary. Just the empty porch, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. The living room, too, seemed quiet, though I noticed the couch pillows were out of place. Odd, but not alarming. It wasn't until I switched to the backyard camera that I saw it. A group of people, laughing and drinking around the pool. Strangers. My pulse quickened as I scanned the faces. Where was Laura? And then there she was, standing by the pool with a glass of wine in her hand. She was laughing at something a man said, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with an arm draped casually around her waist. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Who were these people? Why hadn't she mentioned a party? And who the hell was that guy touching my wife? For a moment, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Laura was social, she loved to entertain. Maybe she'd invited a few friends over, and it had gotten a little out of hand. But as I watched her lean into the man's touch, laughing at something he whispered in her ear, the knot in my stomach tightened. Something was wrong. I closed the app and set my phone down, staring into my drink. My gut told me to call her, to demand an explanation. But another part of me hesitated. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my hotel room, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. That Laura wouldn't betray me like that. That my marriage, the life we'd built together, wasn't a lie. But deep down I knew. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My thoughts had been a mess the entire night, oscillating between rage and denial. Surely there was an innocent explanation for what I'd seen on the camera feed. Maybe the guy was just a friend. Maybe Laura was caught in a moment of bad judgment, letting her social nature run a little wild. But the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. I grabbed my phone and opened the Nest app again, desperate to confirm or deny the suspicions gnawing at me. The house was quiet now, the porch was empty, the living room neat again. Even the backyard showed no signs of life, just an overturned lawn chair by the pool and a couple of half-empty beer bottles sitting on the patio table. "Calm down," I muttered to myself, trying to reason through the fog of emotions clouding my mind. "It's probably nothing." I decided to call her. It was 8 a.m. in Seattle, which meant it was 10 a.m. back home. Laura should have been awake by now. She answered on the third ring. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice warm and casual, though I thought I detected a slight edge of tiredness. "How's the conference?" "Exhausting," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "How about you? What did you get up to last night?" "Oh, nothing much," she said breezily. "Just had Ava and Grace over for a little girls' night. We watched a movie, drank some wine, low-key stuff." Low-key stuff. Her lie was so smooth, so effortless, that for a moment, I questioned myself. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? "Sounds nice," I said, my voice carefully even. "What movie did you guys watch?" She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to set off alarm bells in my head. The Notebook, I think? Or maybe it was Crazy Stupid Love. You know, one of those romantic ones." Laura loved both of those movies, but I knew for a fact she hadn't watched either of them in years. She said they were too overplayed. I forced myself to chuckle, masking the unease that was bubbling beneath the surface. "Classic picks," I said. "Sounds like a good time." "Yeah, it was," she replied quickly, almost as if she wanted to end the conversation. "Anyway, I need to clean up the house. Ava made a mess with the snacks, and you know how Grace always spills her wine. I'll call you later, okay?" "Sure," I said. "Love you." "Love you too," she said before hanging up. I stared at my phone for a long moment after the call ended. The ease with which she had lied to me left a sour taste in my mouth. I needed answers. That evening, after another grueling day of meetings, I returned to my hotel room and logged into the camera system again. This time, I decided to go through the archived footage. If there was nothing incriminating, I'd drop it and move on. But if there was something... The first clip was from earlier in the evening, around 8 p.m. The party was already in full swing. People I didn't recognize were laughing, drinking, and dancing to music that played so loudly I could hear it faintly through the camera's audio feed. Laura stood by the pool, a wine glass in hand, looking every bit like the social butterfly I'd married. She was wearing a black sundress that hugged her curves perfectly, her blonde hair loose and flowing down her back. A man approached her, a different man from the one I'd seen the night before, and leaned in to whisper something in her ear. She laughed, tilting her head in that flirtatious way that used to drive me crazy. I skipped forward in the footage. Around 10 p.m., the party had grown louder and rowdier. The guests were no longer confined to the backyard. Some had moved into the living room, where they danced and drank as though they were in a nightclub. Laura was still outside, but now she was sitting on one of the patio chairs, a man on either side of her. They were laughing, talking animatedly, but something about their body language made my skin crawl. Then came the part that sealed it for me. At 11:15, Laura stood up, holding one of the men's hands, and led him inside. The other man followed closely behind. I switched to the living room feed, my heart pounding as I watched them disappear into the hallway. The hallway that led to our bedroom. I closed the app, my hands shaking. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This was my wife, the woman I had loved and trusted for years. How could she do this to me? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence was stacking up against her. I knew I couldn't confront her yet, not until I had irrefutable proof. My flight home wasn't for another 3 days, but in that moment, I made a decision. I would watch. I would wait. And when the time came, I would make her regret every single one of her lies. This wasn't over. The morning after watching the footage, I sat at the edge of the hotel bed, staring blankly at the carpet. My coffee had gone cold, untouched, as the events of the previous night replayed in my mind like a broken record. Laura's lies. Her laughter. The sight of her leading not one but two men into our bedroom, the place that was supposed to be sacred, ours. I couldn't shake the anger coiled in my gut, tightening with every passing second. But underneath it, there was a voice whispering doubts, planting seeds of hesitation. What if you're overreacting? What if there's an explanation? That voice had been my constant companion since I married Laura. It was the voice that made excuses for her when she came home late without calling. The voice that told me to trust her even when she brushed off my questions with laughter and a kiss. I wasn't listening to it anymore. After a quick shower and a half-hearted attempt to eat breakfast, I opened my laptop and logged into the Nest app again. If last night's footage had left any room for doubt, I was going to erase it. I needed to know exactly what was happening in my home while I was away. I started with the footage from earlier in the day. Around 3 p.m. Laura was in the living room, pacing back and forth with her phone pressed to her ear. She looked stressed, her free hand gesturing wildly as she spoke. "I told you, I'll take care of it," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the background hum of the audio. "No, he won't find out. Just stick to the plan." My blood ran cold. Stick to the plan? What plan? And who the hell was she talking to? I fast-forwarded, watching as she hung up and immediately started tidying the house. She vacuumed the living room, wiped down the kitchen counters, and even lit one of those lavender candles she loved so much. She wasn't just cleaning, she was preparing. By 6 p.m., people started arriving. It was a small group at first, 3 women and 2 men, none of whom I recognized. Laura greeted them warmly, hugging each one as if they were old friends. They brought bottles of wine, trays of food, and even a Bluetooth speaker, which they set up in the backyard. Within an hour, the party had ballooned into something much larger. Strangers milled about, drinking and laughing as music blared from the speakers. I watched Laura flit from guest to guest, her laughter ringing out like a melody. She looked radiant, her black sundress clinging to her curves in all the right places. She looked like the woman I had fallen in love with, except now, I saw her through a different lens. A lens of betrayal. Then he showed up. The man from last night, the one who had draped his arm around Laura by the pool. He arrived with 2 other guys, all of them loud and boisterous, carrying cases of beer like they were frat boys crashing a college party. Laura's face lit up when she saw him. She hugged him, holding him just a little too long, and then led him to the backyard, where they joined a group sitting by the pool. I zoomed in on the camera feed, watching every detail. He leaned in close when he spoke to her, his hand resting on her knee as if it belonged there. She didn't pull away. At one point, he whispered something in her ear, and she laughed, tilting her head back in that flirtatious way that used to be reserved for me. I fast-forwarded again, skipping through hours of footage until I reached the moment I had seen live last night, Laura leading the 2 men into the house. This time, I didn't look away. I switched to the hallway camera, watching as they disappeared into our bedroom. The door closed behind them, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the sound started. Muted laughter. Voices. The creak of the bed frame. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to throw my laptop across the room. I stopped the footage and closed the app, my hands trembling with barely restrained fury. That evening, Laura called again. I stared at the screen as her name flashed across it, debating whether or not to answer. When I finally picked up, I kept my voice steady, masking the storm raging inside me. "Hey, babe," she said, her tone warm and cheerful. "How was your day?" "Long," I replied curtly. "Yours?" "Oh, you know, the usual. I took Max for a walk and ran a couple of errands. Pretty boring stuff." Her lies were like nails on a chalkboard. "Sounds nice," I said, my tone flat. She hesitated, sensing the shift in my mood. "Is everything okay? You sound off." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." "Well, don't overwork yourself," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "You need to take care of yourself, you know." "Yeah," I said. "I'll do that." After the call ended, I sat in the quiet of the hotel room, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. The woman I had married, the woman I had trusted with my heart and my life, wasn't who I thought she was. But she was about to learn that neither was I. By the time I woke up the next morning, my resolve was clear. There was no more room for hesitation, no more benefit of the doubt. Laura was hiding something, or rather someone. And the longer I waited, the more she would think she could keep pulling the strings unnoticed. I had one day left in Seattle before my flight back home. One more day to gather every shred of evidence I needed to make her lies unravel completely. The first step was to review the remaining camera footage from the night of the party. It was like pressing on a bruise, painful, yet impossible to ignore. I opened the Nest app, this time starting from just after the moment they had entered our bedroom. At first, the feed was silent. The bedroom door remained shut, but the faint sounds of muffled laughter and conversation seeped through the audio. My stomach churned as I watched the timestamp tick forward, knowing exactly what was happening on the other side of that door. Then the door opened. The two men from earlier stepped out, their hair disheveled, their shirts untucked. They were laughing, exchanging high fives like they had just won some sick game. I waited, my heart pounding, as Laura appeared moments later. She stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a wine glass in her hand, her hair tousled, her cheeks flushed. She looked smug, satisfied. She walked them to the front door, hugging each of them goodbye as if nothing was out of the ordinary. As if she hadn't just shredded the vows we had made to each other into a million irreparable pieces. I fast-forwarded again, skimming through the footage of her cleaning up the mess. By the time she finally went to bed, the house looked pristine, as if the party had never happened. But I knew better. That night Laura didn't call. For the first time since I'd left, my phone stayed silent. She was testing me, I realized. Waiting to see if I would notice her sudden absence of attention. But if she thought I wasn't paying attention, she was dead wrong. The next morning, I boarded my flight home with one goal in mind: confrontation. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, the house was dark, save for the soft glow of the porch light. For a moment, I sat in the car, staring at the home we had built together. It had always felt like a refuge, a place where I could leave the stress of the outside world behind. Now, it felt like a battlefield. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender candles hitting me immediately. Laura had always been meticulous about creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. The perfect host, the perfect wife, at least on the surface. "Babe?" she called from the living room. Her voice was light, casual, as if nothing had changed. As if she hadn't spent the last few nights entertaining strangers in our home, desecrating everything we had built together. "Hey," I said, setting my bag down and walking into the room. She was curled up on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand and a blanket draped over her lap. She smiled at me, her green eyes sparkling with what I could only describe as mock innocence. "How was the trip?" she asked. "Long," I replied. She tilted her head, studying me. "You look tired. Come sit with me." I didn't move. "How was your week?" She shrugged, taking a sip of her wine. "Pretty uneventful. Same old, same old." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "Uneventful, huh?" "Yeah. Why?" For a moment, I said nothing, letting the tension hang heavy in the air. Then I pulled out my phone and opened the Nest app, scrolling to the footage from the night of the party. Her face paled as I set the phone down on the coffee table, the video playing silently between us. "Do you want to explain this?" I asked, my voice cold and sharp. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide, her breathing shallow. What is this?" "You tell me," I said, crossing my arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you threw a party in my house while I was gone. A party you didn't bother to tell me about. A party where? It's not what it looks like," she blurted, her voice shaking. "Oh, really?" I snapped. "Because it looks like you invited a bunch of strangers into our home. It looks like you lied to me about what you were doing." And it looks like you took 2 men into our bedroom and— Stop! She shouted, cutting me off. Her hands trembled as she set down her wine glass, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising. It wasn't like that. They're just friends, okay? We were just talking. I let out a bitter laugh. Talking? In our bedroom? With the door closed? Do you really think I'm that stupid? Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no regret, just a cold, unyielding rage. You're blowing this way out of proportion, she said, her voice cracking. I made a mistake, okay? But it's not what you think. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? I repeated, my voice deadly quiet. You think that makes it better? I leaned in, my voice low and firm. You think you can lie to me, humiliate me, and then brush it off like it's nothing? She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. Save it, I said. I've heard enough. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there in stunned silence. This was only the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. The bedroom felt like a tomb, haunted by memories of her betrayal. The sheets still smelled faintly of her perfume, and every time I closed my eyes I saw her laughing, whispering in another man's ear, leading them into our sanctuary. Laura spent the night on the couch. I could hear her pacing in the living room, muttering to herself, probably trying to come up with a way to salvage the situation. But I didn't care. I wasn't interested in her excuses. When the sun finally rose, I got out of bed, took a shower, and got dressed for the day. Laura was still sitting on the couch when I walked into the living room, her eyes bloodshot, her face pale. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Morning, I said coldly, ignoring the way her lips trembled as she tried to form a response. Can we talk? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No. She flinched at the harshness of my tone, but I didn't care. I wasn't in the mood for her lies or half-hearted apologies. I grabbed my laptop and headed to the home office, slamming the door shut behind me. Once inside, I booted up my computer and began to plan. If Laura thought she could destroy our marriage without consequences, she was sorely mistaken. I wasn't just going to walk away. I wasn't going to let her paint herself as the victim while I became the villain in her story. No. I was going to take everything from her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. The first step was simple: information. Laura wasn't the type to be careful. She relied on charm and manipulation to cover her tracks, but she never bothered to think about the details. And that was her weakness. I logged into our shared cloud storage and began combing through her files. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for: a folder labeled Personal. Inside were dozens of photos and videos, most of them innocent snapshots of vacations, parties, and random moments from our life together. But buried among them were pictures that told a very different story. Pictures of Laura with other men. There were selfies of her at restaurants and bars, her arm wrapped around a stranger's waist, her smile bright and carefree. There were group photos from what looked like private parties, with Laura pressed against men I didn't recognize. And then there were the videos. I clicked on one at random, my stomach churning as I watched her laugh and flirt with a man who wasn't me. The audio was muffled, but it was clear from their body language that they were more than just friends. I closed the folder, my hands shaking with rage. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. That afternoon, while Laura was out running errands, I installed a GPS tracker on her car. It was a simple device, easy to hide, and it would send me real-time updates on her location. Next, I installed monitoring software on her phone. It was discreet and undetectable, allowing me to see her messages, call logs, and social media activity. By the time she returned home, I had everything in place. Hey, she said cautiously as she walked through the door, carrying a bag of groceries. I didn't respond. I barely even looked at her. Instead, I spent the rest of the day pretending to work, while secretly monitoring her every move. By evening, the first pieces of my revenge were already falling into place. The GPS tracker showed that Laura had made an unscheduled stop at a cafe on the other side of town. Curious, I checked the camera feed from the parking lot. Sure enough, there she was, sitting at an outdoor table with a man I didn't recognize. They were leaning in close, their heads almost touching as they talked. I snapped a screenshot and saved it to a new folder on my laptop, labeled simply Evidence. Then I checked her phone activity. There were dozens of messages between her and someone named Mike, most of them flirty and suggestive. Mike, last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Laura, me too. I wish we could do it again tonight. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I read through the messages. By the time Laura went to bed, I had enough evidence to destroy her. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I want to file for divorce, I said, my voice calm and steady. Are you sure? He asked. Divorces can get messy, especially when there's evidence of infidelity. I'm sure, I replied. And I want it to be as messy as possible. I outlined everything, the camera footage, the messages, the photos. My lawyer listened quietly, taking notes, before finally speaking. We'll need to be strategic, he said. If you want to protect your assets and reputation, we'll need to hit her where it hurts. Do whatever you need to do, I said. I don't care what it costs. He nodded. Understood. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of calm. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. That evening, Laura approached me again, her eyes filled with tears. Can we please talk? She begged. I stared at her, my face blank. We'll talk, I said. Soon. But not the way you think. Her face crumpled, but I didn't stay to watch her fall apart. Instead, I went back to my office, where I began crafting the next phase of my plan. Laura had no idea what was coming. The silence between Laura and me grew deafening over the next few days. She made repeated attempts to talk, her voice soft and pleading, but I stonewalled her every time. I didn't want her excuses, her fake tears, or whatever rehearsed lies she thought might salvage the situation. I wanted her to stew in the uncertainty, to feel the noose tightening around her perfect little life. And she had no idea I was the one pulling it. On Wednesday morning, as she left for yoga, though I highly doubted she was headed there, I sat at my desk and pulled up the GPS tracking app. Sure enough, her car wasn't heading toward the yoga studio. Instead, it was en route to a downtown hotel. My blood ran cold, but I didn't let the anger take over. I knew what I needed to do. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the hotel parking lot, parking far enough away that my car wouldn't be spotted. I had a baseball cap pulled low over my face, blending into the morning crowd as I stepped into the lobby. It didn't take long to spot her. She was sitting at the bar, dressed in a figure-hugging skirt and blouse that screamed date, not workout. Beside her was a man I didn't recognize, likely the infamous Mike from the texts. He leaned in close, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh, her hand brushing against his arm. I fought the urge to walk over and slam his face into the bar. Not yet. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos. They were blurry, taken from a distance, but they were damning enough. Then I followed them upstairs. The elevator ride was a blur of rage and calculation. I stayed a few paces behind them, careful not to draw attention. When they stepped out onto the 8th floor, I waited a moment before following. They entered room 812. I waited until the door shut behind them, then pulled out my phone and dialed the hotel's front desk. Yes, this is Mr. Carlson in room 814, I said, forcing a calm tone. I'm hearing some very disturbing noises from the room next door. Could you send security to check it out? It was a bold move, but one I knew would pay off. 15 minutes later, I was sitting in the hotel cafe, sipping a black coffee as the scene unfolded. 2 security guards escorted a flustered Laura and her lover out of the hotel, their faces pale with embarrassment. Laura was clutching her purse tightly, her hair disheveled, while Mike avoided eye contact with everyone in the lobby. I snapped another photo. This one was perfect. That evening, I finally spoke to her. She was sitting in the living room when I walked in, nursing a glass of wine. Her eyes were puffy from crying, but she tried to compose herself as I sat down across from her. "We need to talk," I said. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I've been trying to." I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Save it. I know everything, Laura. The party, the men, the hotel. I've seen the footage, the texts, everything." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I can explain." "No, you can't," I said coldly. "But you don't have to. It's too late for that." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I'd taken, the ones from the party, the hotel, the texts with Mike. She stared at them, her face draining of color. "Oh my God!" she whispered. "You didn't even bother to hide it," I said, my voice dripping with contempt. "You thought I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't care enough to look. But you were wrong, Laura. So wrong." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't mean for it to happen." "Don't insult me," I snapped, my voice rising. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Every lie, every excuse, every man you brought into our home, you did it all because you thought I wouldn't find out." "I love you," she cried, her voice cracking. "No," I said, standing up. "You love the life I built for you. The house, the money, the comfort. But me? No, Laura. You don't love me." She sobbed, clutching her wine glass like it was a lifeline. "Please, just give me another chance. We can fix this." I laughed bitterly. "Fix this? There's nothing left to fix." I turned and walked toward the stairs, but paused halfway up. "Pack a bag," I said without looking back. "You have until tomorrow morning to get out." She didn't respond. Later that night, I sat in my office, staring at the folder labeled Evidence on my laptop. My lawyer had already drafted the divorce papers, and tomorrow they would be served. But that wasn't enough. I wasn't just going to divorce Laura. I was going to ruin her. I opened Facebook, Instagram, and every other social media platform we shared. Then I began uploading the photos and videos, carefully captioning each one. "This is what betrayal looks like," I wrote beneath a screenshot of her texts with Mike. And then I hit post. When the notifications started rolling in, likes, comments, shares, I leaned back in my chair, feeling a dark satisfaction settle over me. This was only the beginning. The first cracks in Laura's carefully crafted life appeared the next morning. By the time I woke up, the post I'd shared on social media had gone viral. Friends, family, colleagues, everyone who had ever met us, was commenting, sharing, and reacting. The messages in my inbox ranged from sympathy to outrage, while Laura's accounts were eerily silent. I sipped my coffee and stared at my phone, watching her world collapse in real time. Laura emerged from the guest bedroom around noon, her hair a mess, her face pale and drawn. She avoided my gaze as she shuffled into the kitchen, the tension in the air so thick you could choke on it. "Good morning," I said coldly, setting my coffee mug down on the table. She flinched at the sound of my voice but didn't respond. "Have you checked your phone yet?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Her eyes darted to me, wide and panicked. "What do you mean?" "Take a look," I said, gesturing to the phone she had left on the counter. Hesitant, she grabbed it and unlocked the screen. I watched her face as the notifications flooded in. Her expression shifted from confusion to horror, her lips trembling as she scrolled through the countless messages, comments, and tags. "Oh my God!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Surprised?" I asked, my tone dripping with mockery. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this?" "Me?" I shot back, standing up and slamming my hands on the table. "You destroyed this marriage, Laura. You lied, cheated, and humiliated me. All I did was show everyone the truth." Her sobs grew louder as she clutched her phone to her chest. "You've ruined my life. No, I said, my voice icy. You ruined your own life the moment you decided to bring those men into our home. The moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. She sank into a chair, her head in her hands, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of pity. But it was gone as quickly as it came. I told you to pack a bag, I reminded her. You need to be out of here by tonight. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. Where am I supposed to go? Not my problem, I said, turning away. Figure it out. By the time I returned from running errands later that afternoon, Laura's car was gone. I checked the GPS tracker to confirm she was at her friend Ava's house, one of the few people who hadn't unfriended her yet. Satisfied, I stepped inside and began the next phase of my plan. The first step was to contact my lawyer. Did you serve the papers yet? I asked. Not yet, he replied. We plan to deliver them tomorrow. Do it today, I said firmly. I want her out of my life as soon as possible. Understood, he said. Next, I went through our shared finances, combing through every account and transaction. It didn't take long to find evidence of her spending sprees, hotel bookings, bar tabs, extravagant gifts. She had been siphoning money from our joint account for months, funding her affairs while I worked to keep our lives afloat. I transferred what was left into my personal account, leaving her with nothing. That evening, I received a message from Ava. Why are you doing this to her? I stared at the screen, my anger bubbling to the surface. After everything Laura had done, after all the lies and betrayal, she still had people defending her. I typed back a single response: ask her to show you the footage. The following morning, I got a call from my lawyer. It's done, he said. She's been served. Good, I replied. What about the house? It's in your name, so there won't be any issues. She'll have no legal claim to it. Perfect, I said, a grim satisfaction settling over me. Laura called me later that day, her voice shaking with fury. How dare you serve me divorce papers? She spat. We could have worked through this. There's nothing to work through, I interrupted. You made your choices, Laura. Now you get to live with the consequences. But you didn't have to humiliate me like this, she cried. Everyone's talking about it. My friends, my family, even my boss. I smirked, though she couldn't see it. Maybe you should have thought about that before you cheated on me. You're a monster, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. No, Laura, I said calmly. I'm just the man who finally stopped putting up with your bullshit. I hung up, blocking her number. Over the next few days, the fallout continued to spread. Friends who had once idolized Laura began distancing themselves. The private messages I received painted a clear picture. No one wanted to be associated with the woman who had betrayed her husband so publicly. Even her parents reached out to me, apologizing for her behavior. We don't know what's gotten into her, her mother said over the phone, her voice filled with shame. This isn't the daughter we raised. She made her choices, I replied curtly. Now she gets to live with them. By the end of the week, Laura was nothing more than a ghost in my life. The house was quiet, the social media frenzy had died down, and my lawyer assured me the divorce would be finalized within a month. But I wasn't done yet. There was still one more move to make, one that would ensure she could never crawl her way back. By the time Laura moved out, her life was already in shambles. The fallout from my social media posts had been more devastating than even I anticipated. Her so-called friends had turned their backs on her, her family barely spoke to her, and she'd lost her job after her boss deemed her too much of a liability. But I wasn't satisfied. Not yet. She thought she could humiliate me and walk away with nothing. She thought she could ruin my life and still land on her feet. I was going to make sure she stayed on her knees. The first step was contacting her former boss, a man named Greg. He owned the small marketing firm where Laura had worked for years, and we had always been on polite terms. When I called him, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. Jason, I don't know what's going on, but the last few days have been insane, he said. Laura's behavior has caused a PR nightmare for the company. I had no choice but to let her go. I understand, I replied, keeping my tone measured. But I thought you should know there's more to the story. What do you mean? I sent him the photos and screenshots I had collected, proof of Laura's affairs, her reckless spending, and her manipulative lies. This is the woman you trusted to represent your company, I said. Do you really think she'll keep quiet about what happened? Or do you think she'll try to twist the narrative to make herself look like the victim? Greg was silent for a moment, processing what I had just told him. Thanks for the heads up, he said finally. I'll make sure she doesn't get the chance to cause any more trouble. I hung up, knowing Greg would do exactly what I wanted, blacklist Laura from every professional connection she had. Next, I turned my attention to Mike, the man she had been seeing during my trip. I found his Instagram profile with minimal effort, scrolling through photos of him posing with luxury cars, expensive watches, and the occasional gym selfie. He clearly thought he was untouchable, a smooth operator who could do whatever he wanted without consequences. He was about to learn otherwise. I sent him an anonymous message, attaching the photos and videos of him with Laura at the hotel. Enjoy the attention while it lasts. Your boss, your girlfriend, and your family will be seeing this next. The panic was almost immediate. He replied within minutes, begging me to reconsider. Please, man, don't do this. I didn't know she was married. It was a mistake. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the evidence to his employer, his girlfriend, and his parents. By the time I was done, Mike's profile had gone dark, and his name was being dragged through the mud just like Laura's. But the piece de resistance came a few days later, when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. While digging through our financial records, I noticed a series of payments I didn't recognize. They were small at first, $200 here, $300 there, but they added up over time. At first, I thought it was just another sign of her reckless spending. But when I traced the payments, I realized they were going to a man I'd never heard of. A private investigator. Laura had been digging into my finances, my business dealings, my life. She had been planning her escape for months, maybe even years, gathering leverage to use against me when the time came. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. But instead of confronting her, I decided to turn the tables. I hired my own private investigator, a man named Paul, to find out everything he could about Laura's recent activities. Within a week, he had compiled a file that left no stone unturned. He found the private investigator she had hired, confirmed that she had been planning to siphon money from our accounts, and even discovered that she had been meeting with a divorce lawyer long before I filed. She had been preparing to leave me with nothing while she ran off to start a new life with one of her boyfriends. The irony wasn't lost on me. Armed with this information, I sent copies of the file to her parents, her remaining friends, and anyone else who might still have sympathy for her. This is the woman you're defending, I wrote in the accompanying email. The woman who lied, cheated, and stole from the people who trusted her. The responses were immediate and overwhelmingly supportive. Her parents, once hesitant to take sides, called me in tears, apologizing profusely for her behavior. We had no idea, her mother said, her voice trembling. She's not the daughter we raised. But the final blow came when I received a call from Paul. I found something you're going to want to see, he said. He had dug into her social media accounts, finding private messages she thought were hidden. In them, Laura had been bad-mouthing me to everyone who would listen, painting herself as the victim of an emotionally distant husband who didn't appreciate her. She had even joked about how easy it would be to clean me out in the divorce. I forwarded the messages to my lawyer, who assured me that they would ensure she left with nothing. By the time I was done, Laura had no job, no money, no friends, and no reputation. I blocked her number, deleted her from every account, and changed the locks on the house. She was gone. But I wasn't done. For the first time in weeks, my life felt almost normal. The house was quiet, the chaos had subsided, and I was finally able to focus on work without Laura's presence haunting me. But it was a fragile peace. I knew Laura wouldn't disappear quietly. People like her, entitled, manipulative, and vindictive, never did. And when the storm hit, it hit hard. It started with a phone call from Ava, one of Laura's closest friends, though friend felt like too strong a word. "She's staying with me," Ava said, her tone cold. "And I think he should know she's not doing well." "What does that have to do with me?" I replied, feigning indifference. "She's been drinking," Ava said. "A lot. And she's talking about things that worry me. You may hate her, Jason, but she's still a person. She doesn't deserve this." I laughed bitterly. "She didn't seem too concerned about what I deserved when she brought other men into my home. Maybe she should focus on fixing her own mess instead of blaming me." "She says you've ruined her life," Ava shot back. "No," I said firmly. "She ruined her own life. I just made sure everyone saw it." I hung up before she could respond. That same night, I received an email from Laura. It was a rambling, incoherent mess, filled with typos and drunken confessions. "Jason, please. I'm begging you. I made a mistake, okay? I know I hurt you, but I never thought it would go this far. You've destroyed me. I have nothing left. Please just, let's talk. I'll do anything to fix this." I stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting the email. She was trying to manipulate me again, pulling at my emotions, hoping I'd take pity on her. But I was done playing her games. The next day, Laura escalated. My phone buzzed with a barrage of texts, all from unknown numbers. Friends of hers, former coworkers, even distant acquaintances, all of them parroting the same message: "You've gone too far." "Why are you doing this to Laura?" one text read. "She's suffering enough. Leave her alone." "She made a mistake," another said. "That doesn't mean you have to ruin her entire life." The audacity of it made me laugh. None of these people had seen the footage, read the messages, or lived through the betrayal. They didn't know the full story, and they didn't care. I ignored them all. But Laura wasn't done. 2 days later, I came home to find a handwritten note shoved under my door. "Jason, you can't keep ignoring me. I know you're hurting, but I'm hurting too. Let me explain. Let me make this right. Please." I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. She didn't stop. Emails, texts, voicemails, they kept coming, each one more desperate than the last. She showed up at the house twice, banging on the door and screaming for me to let her in. Both times I called the police, and both times she was gone before they arrived. And then came the threats. "If you don't stop this, I'll tell everyone what you're really like," she wrote in one email. "I'll ruin you, Jason. You think you're untouchable, but you're not." It was laughable. She had already tried to paint herself as the victim, and it had backfired spectacularly. No one believed her anymore, not after everything I'd exposed. But it wasn't the empty threats that concerned me. It was the fact that she was unraveling. Desperate people do desperate things, and I wasn't about to let her drag me down with her. I contacted my lawyer the next morning. "I want a restraining order," I said. "She hasn't crossed the line into anything illegal yet," he replied. "But if she keeps harassing you, we can build a case." "Let's start building," I said. "I'm not waiting for her to snap." The final straw came a week later. I was sitting in my office, reviewing some contracts, when my phone buzzed with a notification from the security system. Someone was at the front door. I pulled up the camera feed and froze. It was Laura. She looked disheveled, her hair a mess, her makeup smeared. She was clutching a bottle of wine in one hand and a crumpled piece of paper in the other. She pounded on the door, her voice slurred as she shouted my name. "Jason! Open the door!" I stayed silent, watching as she ranted and raved, pacing back and forth on the porch. "You can't ignore me forever!" she screamed. "You think you're better than me? You're nothing without me, Jason! Nothing!" She hurled the bottle at the door, the glass shattering into a million pieces. I called the police. When they arrived, Laura was still there, slumped on the porch, sobbing into her hands. She didn't resist as they escorted her to their car. She just kept repeating the same phrase over and over. He ruined me. He ruined everything. I watched from the window, my face expressionless. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The restraining order was approved the next day. The restraining order changed everything. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could breathe without the constant weight of Laura's chaos hanging over me. She wasn't allowed within 500 feet of me, my house, or my workplace. Any attempt to contact me, directly or through a third party, would result in immediate legal consequences. But while the distance gave me peace, it didn't give me closure. Laura's absence wasn't an end, it was a void filled with the echoes of her betrayal. And I wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the restraining order was served, my lawyer called with an update on the divorce proceedings. She's agreed to the terms, he said. No contest. She's desperate to avoid court. Of course she was. A court case would mean dragging her affairs, her financial mismanagement, and every sort of detail of her betrayal into the open. She gets nothing, right? I asked. Not a dime. He confirmed. The house, the accounts, your assets, they're all protected. She'll leave with what she brought into the marriage, which, from what I can tell, isn't much. Good, I said. Make sure it's airtight. I don't want her coming back later to try and dig her claws into me. That same night, I got an unexpected text from a number I didn't recognize. Jason, it's me. Please don't block this number. I just need to talk to you. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting with a mix of anger and exhaustion. Against my better judgment, I replied. What do you want, Laura? I just need closure, she wrote. Can we meet? Just once? I promise I won't make a scene. I almost laughed. The woman who had lied, cheated, and stolen from me now wanted closure? There's nothing to talk about, I replied. You made your choices. Now live with them. Her response came immediately. You don't understand. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was lost, Jason. I made mistakes, but I never stopped loving you. The audacity of it all made my blood boil. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done what you did. Goodbye, Laura. I blocked the number. The final straw came a week later when Ava reached out again, this time with a message that made my skin crawl. Laura tried to borrow money from me today, she wrote. She's saying you've blacklisted her, that she can't find work because of you. She's desperate. You need to talk to her. I stared at the message, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. This wasn't my problem. Laura's desperation wasn't my responsibility. I wrote back a single sentence, tell her to stay away from me. But Laura didn't stay away. 2 days later, she showed up at my workplace. The restraining order meant nothing to her anymore. She was too far gone, too consumed by her own misery to care about the consequences. I was in a meeting when one of my employees burst into the conference room, their face pale. There's a woman in the lobby, they said. She's causing a scene. My stomach sank as I stood up and walked toward the front of the building. Sure enough, there she was, standing in the middle of the lobby, shouting my name. Her hair was a mess, her makeup smeared, and her voice cracked with desperation. Jason, she screamed. You can't ignore me. You can't just throw me away like this. Security was already moving to escort her out, but she shoved past them, her eyes wild as they locked onto mine. This isn't over, she shouted. You think you've won, but you haven't. You'll regret this, Jason. I swear to God, you'll regret this. I didn't respond. I didn't flinch. I simply turned and walked away, letting the guards drag her out of the building. Later that night, I sat in my office, staring out the window as the city lights twinkled in the distance. Laura was gone, truly, finally gone, but the scars she left behind would take much longer to heal. I thought about everything we had been through, everything I had sacrificed for her, and how easily she had thrown it all away. She didn't deserve closure. She didn't deserve forgiveness. And she didn't deserve me. The divorce was finalized the following week. Laura disappeared from my life entirely after that. No more emails, no more texts, no more unannounced visits. It was as if she had finally accepted that she was no longer a part of my story. But I wasn't the same man I had been before. I had trusted her once, loved her with everything I had, and she had used that trust against me. Never again. As I closed the chapter on Laura and everything she represented, I felt a strange sense of peace. There was no happy ending here, no redemption, no reconciliation, no soft fade into mutual understanding. There was only the cold, hard truth. Some betrayals cut too deep to ever heal. And some people deserve exactly what they get.